to take the time now to introduce Bill Martin, who has so graciously come from the Valentine Richmond History Center to share not only what the museum has to offer, as we understand and learn more about our city, but also stories to help us understand the narrative of the city that we've been called to. Bill Martin holds a BA in Urban Studies and an MA in Public Administration from Virginia Tech. Martin joined the Valentine Museum, which is now the Valentine Richmond History Center, in 1993 as the Director of Marketing and Public Relations, following years of experience as the Director of Museums in Georgia, Florida, and Virginia. In 1995, he was promoted to the position of Executive Director. Under his leadership, the institution has mounted 2 capital campaigns raising more than $10 million, undergone significant name and brand changes, and greatly increased and diversified its programming. Martin is also active in our community, serving on numerous boards, committees, and task forces in support of the health and diversity of the greater Richmond region. Bill, I am so thankful that you agreed to come, and he's going to present for about 30 to 35 minutes and then take questions.
That's all. It's great to be with you this morning. I have had the privilege of being at one of the most remarkable institutions in the country, the Valentine, one of those hidden treasures in downtown, created by this guy here, man Valentine, after the Civil War, as a place where Richmonders could come to discover the world, but also discover their own history. It's an interesting place. This one. We're in trouble now. Okay. Just a little bit of background about the Valentines, because I will be telling lots of stories today, so that if you want to stop at any moment and go, what in the world is that? Because I think what the Valentine has always been about is creating this new sense and narrative of Richmond's history. It's really hard to imagine, but in 1902, this pioneer family created this institution, and in 1902, the board voted unanimously that we would provide free access to our public programs, to Richmond Public Schools, black and white, and we've been free ever since to Richmond Public Schools. For 50 to 60 years of Richmond's history, the Valentine Museum was the only museum in the city that a black child could attend. And so those are the kinds of things that inform everything we did. But how did they afford to do this? Well, one of the brothers, after the Civil War, his wife was sick. He went down to the basement of his house, cooked up this stuff. She drank it, she got better. She told her friends, they told their friends, and a product called Valentine's meat juice. And some of you may remember Valentine's meat juice. It was sold all over the world, and that really became the basis of the family wealth. And what's interesting is how people use their wealth. I think there's a story here for all of us. This is a family that, if you go to the Caroline, the chairman of the committee to build the Caroline was a Valentine. If you go to the Poe Museum, the Valentines purchased that house and gave it to the RVA. There are projects across the city. The Visiting Nurses was founded by Valentine. And in fact, Lila Mead Valentine is the only woman that has a monument in the Capitol. And she was an early advocate for women's rights, rights to vote. So from the Mead Juice Company, they really expanded their ideas of what they could do for the city. These are our founding brothers, not surprisingly, the parents in the background, and 7 brothers. I will tell you that we have a limit now on the number of Valentines on our board. We keep it to 2. But it is remarkable what they did. They began to collect all over the world. And so today we have a collection of about 1.5 million objects in the collection. And museum directors don't always like to be too competitive, but I will tell you that how many objects are in that big Virginia museum? 38,000. We actually have more costumes and textiles and quilts than are in the number of objects that are in the entire Virginia Museum. And so this is a really interesting history that we have to protect. The largest object was where the museum started. In 1812, this house built by John Wickham. And this is really the 200th anniversary of this house. Imagine Richmond in 1812. There's a war, really the Second War of American Independence. Richmond is sending troops to fight in the north along the Great Lakes. But it was a very different place than we imagine today. Believe it or not, in 1812, how many people do you think were in Richmond? 10,000. There's always, those folks at St. John's always love to talk about St. John's Church, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but how many people in Richmond when Patrick Henry made his speech? 800. This is a very small place, and yet it had this importance in the national scene. 1812, how many of the first presidents? All the first presidents are coming from Virginia. Virginia is the capital of the largest state and the capital of the state that has the largest economic impact in the new states. We forget those things, and yet we can see it in the kind of wealth that was being established and the aspirations. I think part of it is, what were these folks aspiring? They were only hiring, Randy, they were only hiring the best architects. So that you find Robert Mills designing buildings, and Paris and others, important American architects commissioned in Richmond to be building houses. And so we can look at this period in this house as an opportunity to look at 1810, 1812 wall paintings like no other house. These are really important things that tell us a great deal about life in the city. But there's some other things about 1810 and 1812 that I think is interesting. When this house was built, it was the outer limits of town. In fact, the street that we're on, Clay Street, was the last street. You would look out the window, and you would look down Shockoe Valley and Shockoe Creek. That's how isolated the city was, and how small the city was. But when we think about that population, and I know that John Neeser's coming next week to talk about demographics and statistics, the demographics of Richmond in 1812 are fascinating. 5,000 people, 10,000 people, 5,000 slaves, 5,000 African Americans. Of those 5,000 African Americans, over 1,000 were free blacks. And so that Richmond had this very interesting situation in the early part of the 19th century. And of the 5,000 whites, it's a much more diverse community than you can ever imagine. And what we've been doing recently is, if you take the census, if you look at, there was a terrible theater fire in 1811. If you look at who died in that fire in 1811, you get a really interesting sense of what Richmond would have been. Who died? There were slaves. There were free blacks. But when you think about all the other people, there was an entire Jewish family that was killed. Grandchildren, children, grandfather. All wiped out in one evening. There were large groups of French Huguenots who moved to this country and had settled in Richmond. There was a school field trip of teenage girls who had gone to the theater that evening, who joined the governor and others. That's not the picture, I think, when we think of Richmond in 1810. It's a much more dynamic picture than this sort of white-black version that we continue to get. And so the house, again, provides us that opportunity to talk about a very different part of Richmond. There are also things like the studio or the garden that provides. There was Edward Valentine was an artist. Yes, there were artists and creative people in Richmond from the very beginning. And I think we forget that creative impulse is an important part. And so Valentine from the studio created many of the works around Richmond that we all know, from a version of Lee. I will tell you a quick story about this Lee. This Lee was never executed because they were fighting over who was going to get to own the Lee. Doesn't surprise you. There was a women's group who wanted Lee on Church Hill, and there was a men's group that wanted Lee on Capitol Square. They were fighting, neither one of them could raise enough money. The women commissioned Valentine to do this. This is actually a likeness. I mean, everything about this is right. We even have in the collection the boots that Lee was wearing. So we know the feet are the right size. But it was never executed because they were not able to get the money. Finally, the General Assembly of Virginia intervenes in the situation and says, if you build it on Monument Avenue, this sort of new real estate development, you'll be able to do it. And so we still have the original Lee. But I think that, and we'll go collection by collection, because this is where you really can find some things. What's in the closet? What's 1.5 million pictures? What do you have? Well, we have the most remarkable costumes and textiles. So you have a dress like this worn Westover plantation, 18th century, to a quilt, this applique quilt made. You know, we often don't focus on the work of women. History is always written by men for the most part, and so the perspective of women working on these farms and plantations and in the houses of Richmond, what was their life like? How was it constructed? What was their freedom within the community? How did it change? To something like this. This is not nightwear, I will tell you. It's interesting the impact, and I spoke, I don't offend someone in the room today, I'm going to be really upset. But it's really interesting the impact of religion and faith in Richmond. And what does this have to do with this? Well, it's very interesting because this is 1812, essentially. This is a dress that was worn by one of Virginia's first ladies. Yes, it's not nightwear. It's very different than what you think, isn't it? There are no hoops, bustles, or any of those things. In fact, it was a radical period in American history. From 1790 to 1820, this period that I think Richmond needs to think about a lot more. When the way we thought about ourselves, the way we thought about gender, is really very different. So that you have, during this period, a lot of drinking. In fact, people were drunk all the time, I think. I think if you look at the level of consumption of alcohol that's reported, and because there was not really an easy access to pure water, and so in the absence of that, you drank. And so it was be quiet ports and pints and pipes of beer all day. But you also have something like this, which talks about women's sexuality and access. And so this is very revealing, guys. In fact, what would happen is that the stories are told that women during this period would have actually wet themselves down just a little bit, so that it would have been a lot more revealing. Sort of an early wet t-shirt competition. What you find is by the 1820s that there is a religious revival in Virginia and across the country that begins, and then you begin to see this reflected in the clothing that people are wearing, both men and women. The clothes change pretty dramatically. So when we think about Richmond in the 1820s, it was a pretty open period, one that's very different than what we imagine. When we think of our founding fathers, we do think of a fairly staid group of individuals. To quilts, like this wonderful crazy quilt made after the Civil War. To Saracen hats. Anyone have a Saracen hat in their collection? Downtown shopping was an important milliner in Miller and Rose. So the collection has everything. It has everything from children's clothes, like these, that were custom made. At one point in Richmond, there were 3 small shops that custom made children's clothes. These are actually were owned by Stuart Ryan, who owns the newspaper. But it's also how do you document the rest of the story of Richmond? If you were thinking about creating a story that reflected, what would you collect today to bring that story alive? Something like this would actually help. This is from the late 1960s. It's the first woman's streetcar uniform. The changing role of women and how it's reflected in their clothes. But we also have the great stuff. This is 1955, Valentine, Paris, designed for someone in Richmond. But it's also about our second largest collection, our photography collection. We have over 1 million photographs. And from the beginning of photography, in 1858, we have the earliest known photograph of Richmond taken from the top of Churchill looking into the city to 50,000 glass plate negatives like this one. We've always been the center of education, and this sort of proves that. This is the Egyptian building on the medical campus, medical college campus. An amazing building, Egyptian revival style. When they moved the medical school up from Farmville to Richmond, and they built what is this great confection of a building. And Richmond, from that point on, becomes the center of medical education. I think we need to talk about that more as we reconstruct the narrative. It's about we really need to think about Richmond as the state capital. If you talk to people in economic development and city government, it's as if the state government doesn't exist. And yet, state government is a major engine for Richmond's economic vitality. So I think rediscovering the notion of being the capital is an important piece of what we need to do. This is really the capital right after the Civil War. And look at the changes. The wings are not added. There are no steps. And in fact, the original Jefferson design for this building did not have those wonderful steps. The steps, actually, the entrances were on the side, which explains the central hall through the middle of the Capitol. To this photograph of Richmond after the fire. But everyone's seen this picture, but what you don't see is right here. Virginia, tea, and coffee. When we think of Richmond before the Civil War, what do you think?
Tobacco.
Tobacco, slaves, those are the things that were really driving the economy. Well, maybe. But if you go back just a little bit earlier, there were a lot of other drivers for Richmond's economy. And the hint is right there. At one point in our history, Richmond was the #1 flour milling city in the world. There's tiny, tiny remnants of it left on the south side, in Manchester along the old canals. But it was also, other things were going on here. We were sending ships full of flour into Central and South America, and what were they bringing back? They were bringing back coffee and guano. Why guano? And ammunition. Ammunition and fertilizer. And so that the economy of Richmond is much more diverse than we think. And the only way we get to see that, because essentially all of those industries are now underground. You can't really find any of those remnants left other than a few flour mills on the other side. And yet it was the economic engine, because we were at the end of that canal, bringing products in from the middle of the state. So it's a really important period that we need to think about, that Richmond's economy is strongest when it's more diverse. It's also about people who went against the grain. This is Elizabeth Van Loo's house, Churchill. Anyone know Elizabeth Van Loo? Spy. Yes.
I'm a New Yorker. Partly Dutch descent.
It's okay. Well, there's a special session. But when you think about the people that have consistently, and actually we're doing a new exhibition that will look at people who have gone against the sort of dominant idea of what a place ought to be. And Elizabeth Van Loo is certainly one of those individuals. During the Civil War, her house was really the ground zero for intelligence on Confederate activity within the city. And then after the Civil War, she is given the postmaster. She's made postmaster of the city of Richmond in recognition for her service. The moment she dies, I will tell you the house was torn down and a school was built. Because we really don't, the things that confront us with things that we've done that are different parts of our history, we tend to tear down. You won't find a building related to slavery in Richmond. You won't find houses of individuals who have been below the process of sort of subverting Richmond's culture. And I think that those are the things that we need to, as part of reconstructing our story, we need to think about. It's a group like this. This is an amazing, landmark, crazy important photograph. It is the first integrated jury ever seated in the United States, and it was in Richmond, Virginia, for a trial that didn't happen. I'll tell you that it was for the trial of Jefferson, Davis. But again, do we think, when we think of Richmond's history, do we think 1868, this photograph? I don't think we do. It's a photograph like this one, taken with shock at the bottom in the 1880s. In the years after the Civil War, life for African Americans in Richmond was very, very different. And I think there are two periods of Richmond's history when there was a greater sense of agency within the African American community than we think. There was that early period, the 1790s to the 1820s, when slavery was kind of this mushy thing, which no one knew exactly what was going on. And then after the Civil War, when again, no one really knew how to confront all those issues. This is a family celebrating Emancipation Day in downtown, right in the bottom, great silk banner celebrating Lincoln. Some of the research that we've done has actually been around the idea of celebrations of emancipation. What we've discovered is that immediately after the Civil War, until the 1890s, you can begin to see, by looking at parade routes for Emancipation Day celebrations, you can begin to see how the city closed down around Richmond's black community. And so by the time we get to the new Virginia Constitution, that essentially limits and excludes all African-American participation in the political process. Suddenly you can see it reflected in things on the ground like parades. Really interesting, we do a lot of work around parades. It's about religion, and I'm going to do some Presbyterian stuff in a second. But I do think that one of the things that museums don't do a very good job of is talking about the role of faith. We just don't do it. I think we're totally afraid of it, and I'm not sure why. But if you look at the history of First Baptist Church, we can really talk about that. This is that first church, where it's located on the corner of College and Broad. There's a First African Baptist churches there today. And that is one of the most important corners in Richmond for understanding faith and our community. Baptists come to Richmond to build their first church in 1782, and it is an integrated congregation. Black and whites, slave, free, all worship together in that church. It was one of the largest buildings at the time, and so it was used not only as a church, but if there was a concert, a lecture, everything in the community happened around that building because it was huge. Kind of hard to imagine, but it's a huge building. But what happens is as the nature of slavery changes, this congregation changes. And so suddenly the walls begin to collapse in, and you see that the white congregation by 1820, the Baptists there were restrictions on who can speak to black congregations that are passed by the legislature. And suddenly you see that the Baptist church splits over how we're going to deal with the issue of slavery. And so in this particular church's case, the white congregation, this is the most absurd part, they move a block up the street. They move a block up the street and get Thomas U. Walter, famous American architect, to design their building. And they leave their black members in this building, the original building. They're a block away. They're all living in that same neighborhood, because again, Richmond's not very big. Richmond's not very big. But what happens, I think, in the 1940s is even more interesting. Both congregations leave downtown. First Baptist moves to Monument Avenue. First African Baptist moves to Barton Heights. Because they're moving where their members actually are living. So not only we're separate in so many ways, but the sort of evolution of the Baptist faith really gives us a hint on how race relations are changing, how we've begun to segregate ourselves, even in our churches. I would just say let's be careful about what we think about our past, and that there are many people who would love to think about and glamorize the past. This is an interesting view for me, because this is actually the location where most of the slave markets in Richmond were located. And for much, beginning after the Civil War, it became the landfill. And that is a 6-story trash heap. But even more telling, I think, is that wonderful white building at the top. That's the White House of the Confederacy. So that there are, I have some of my friends at the Museum of the Confederacy complain about their view today. I'm not sure we want to reenact this one. But our collection does allow us to do a lot of different things. It allows us to look at the role of women and women in the workplace here. In the years after World War II, and even before, this was a major place of employment for women from across the South. would come to Richmond because there were many jobs. And in fact, my grandmother was one of those who came to Richmond as an early Irish immigrant and worked in one of the cigarette factories. She lived in a one-room apartment in Churchill. It's about the separation of work. This is an engine works, the Richmond Engine Works. It also gives us some hints about jobs that come and go. This is a woman who took her husband's job as a bus driver during World War II. The moment he came home, she lost her job. It confirms things that we already know. Some of the photographs gives us some assurance. Yes, chocolate bottom floods.
Surprise.
And it's going to flood. This is the 1924 flood. And cities are going to change. This is 1890. The statue has just gone up. There's going to be suburban expansion. It's going to happen. How do we define it? What does our community look like? This is actually the monument going up. This is the Lee statue going up in 1890. It's the first of the monuments that are erected. This was a pivot point. Richmond in the 1890s, and I'll stop just a little bit to talk about Richmond in the 1890s. Interesting place, because suddenly Richmonders are, what you find is, it's the last of the veterans of the Civil War time. And they're trying to decide how we're going to construct our memory. And I think what's interesting is we see every time we get to a point where the veterans of large wars die, we start to try to construct that idea of what that means. So what happens in Washington just in the last few years? We build the statue to World War II. What do we do as the last members of the Civil Rights Movement begin to die? Martin Luther King goes up in the city. Monuments are this really interesting, it's how we construct the way we want to be remembered. And in Richmond, we do that with Monument Avenue, but it's also in a variety of social institutions that we create that support that memory. So in Richmond, we have the Women's Club being founded, the Commonwealth Club being founded, the Country Club of Virginia is established, St. Christopher's and St. Catherine's School. All of these things that we just sort of assume we're always here, all are being built in the 1890s as a way of creating this whole different, I would say, alternative universe that certain parts of Richmond's leadership could really hide in. And that's what I think is really interesting about the 1890s. Also, the Valentine Museum, 1892, is created. It's like, we want to make sure we control this history. We want to make sure we control this. And also, the Museum of the Confederacy is created, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of Confederate Veterans are all things that are created in the 1890s, 30 years after the Civil War. But it's how do we construct a world that makes us feel good about what we've done. It's about the flour mills across the river. It's about Capitol Square. It's about the flour sellers in the downtown markets. It's about protest. This is the one of the first sit-ins at the Woolworths downtown. We actually have this lunch counter in our collection. It's about shopping, how shopping has changed downtown, the divisions that we used to find on Broad Street. One side's white, one side's black. In our collection, we have this wonderful notebook, scrapbook. One of the first businesses, there was a men's clothing store that was on the wrong side, but they only, for most of their history, had only served the white community. And there's a great story, this binder of things that we've gotten from this gentleman who owns buildings. The indoor trolley lines extended out from downtown into a variety of locations. Now, when we think about trolleys today, we think public transportation. We think that the government ought to be doing these things, maybe. Well, in 1890, when the trolley lines were being built, these two objects existed together. This is a punch bowl from Ballard's Hotel. Ballard owned two hotels, the Exchange Hotel and Ballard's Hotel, right down from the Capitol. So our governor could look out the window, and our legislators could look out the window when they were in town and see the slave markets. They could also look out their windows very convenient for the time for prostitution and alcohol. Everything from the capital down to the bottom was this interesting mix of things. And some of those businesses remained. In fact, in the 1930s was the last time we cleaned up that area. And in the 1930s with WPA projects and other things, the area between the capital and the bottom was really cleaned up. But at that point, it was all nick joints and prostitutes. And then on to slavery. But this punch bowl was at the Ballards Hotel in the dining room, but in that same room, while punch was being drunk out of this bowl, people were waiting their sale. Not all the auctions occurred in Lumpkin's jail. In fact, that area was much broader in the way we think about it. But these objects need to be shown together to sort of show the dynamics between the two. It's about access to political power. This is a ballot box actually used by Reconstruction government in Richmond. I want you to talk a little bit about how we've kind of changed our history. There's anybody in this room, if you have, I will get the big prize. Anybody have heard of something called the Readjuster Party? It would be you. But thank you. The Readjuster Party is a really interesting party in Virginia history, and no one knows about it. There was Reconstruction, and then there was a 10-year period when this odd party called the Readjuster Party ruled Virginia politics. We had a Readjuster governor. We elected Readjuster to the House of Representatives, Senate. Really an interesting thing. It was this odd alliance of free blacks, radical Republicans, and some poor landowners. And it was over the issue, it was a tax issue, who was going to pay for West Virginia's debt. Before the Civil War, there were all these capital improvements that the state of Virginia had paid for. And the question was who was going to be responsible for that. The Readjuster Party said, let the West Virginians pay for their part of the debt. Just because it was done under one state doesn't mean we need to pay for it. But this party was able to do some remarkable things. They created Virginia State University, the first state-supported liberal arts college in the country for African Americans. Big deal. Central State Hospital, the first mental hospital to provide health care for African Americans with mental challenges. They also modified Virginia's constitution to guarantee equal access to public education. Kind of an odd mix of things. And it didn't take long for Virginians to, and one of the reasons that we had this new constitution in the 1890s was because of the Readjusters. It was such a radical time that the response was a radical change to the Constitution. George Mahone, who was a Confederate general, yes, an amazing, amazing guy. Probably a political, how does the city celebrate his return? One thing it does is it commissions a portrait of James Armistead. Richmond City Council, 1824, commissions this portrait because they know that Lafayette's coming back, and so when Lafayette rides into Richmond, sitting on the welcoming platform for him is John Marshall and James Armistead Lafayette, who had taken his last name and had been given his freedom. That's a pretty amazing story. It's one that we sometimes use to make ourselves feel more comfortable about the other horrible things, other horrors of this period. But there are examples of people that were working outside of that box. But it is about the slave trade and the horrors of that, the impact on our community. It's about John Marshall. But it's also about, as part of our paintings, we have a lot of signs in our collection. It's about the U-Cross. Where else would you find a grocery store that has us all go to church? It's about advertising, how we've sold ourselves and our products around the world. It's about a record of our buildings. It's about the alternative view of Richmond. This is looking down the river along the canal. It's about tragedy and how we mark this. This is the Robert Mills building for Monument Church. We talked earlier about the tragedy of fire, but the response was even more interesting. This is where I get to the Presbyterians. Can't wait. This is my favorite Presbyterian story. Sorry. After the Great Fire, the theater fire, there was real conflict in the community about how do you deal with this kind of tragedy? How do you deal with this tragedy? And so the response was varied. And on one side you had Episcopalians, fairly well established in the community. And many of the folks that died in the fire were Episcopalian. They said, well, you know, it's a tragedy.